Howdy, all you delicious people. We are here today to review Terminator Dark Fate. Of course, as per usual, I'm going to attack this review and do it in a non spoiler and then spoiler variation. So, reasonably, we're just kind of go at this. And for people who haven't seen it yet and have quite possibly a future possibility of being able to see it, because the fate of the future is not set. Maybe you're going to be able to see this at some point. But if people who had already seen this, I know a lot of people have reviewed this already, and a lot of the times not had a positive thing to say about it. So I kind of already kind of went into this knowing what to expect, kind of knowing full well, maybe not in spoiler terms, but ultimately I just kind of felt um, that I was just kind of like, okay, I just want to see every Terminator movie, whether this one's good, bad, or indifferent. Like I just kind of want to see what another Terminator movie provides because I've kind of watched every single one of these things, and I've kind of watched them, some of them very repeatedly, some of them not much at all past one viewing and stuff like that. Because ultimately, there were some of them that I thought were ultimately action wise very good, and story wise just kind of they're just kind of okay. Um, so for this movie, how did I ultimately feel about it? Granted, we have kind of everybody back in town. We have James Cameron directing this film. We have a lot of people from uh, Justice Judgment Day, Terminator 2 back into this, T2 back into this movie. Ultimately, how did I overall feel about this movie? Well, overall, I thought that the movie kind of felt very, like, cheap to me. It kind of felt very much on the cheap end. Um, I am ultimately going to say that the beginning of this movie was really slow. The beginning of this movie was really slow. And you know what? Like half of this movie seems to be in a different language, which is always great to have to read subtitles in an action film, which makes no sense. Ultimately, to break this down, the only good thing about this entire film is its action sequences. That's the only good thing that's about this film is just the action. The story is just kind of seemingly a big old retcon where the future has to be completely changed because new writers, new like they don't even want to even try to even touch on much of the future stuff. They just want to get right into the current time and this and that. The new characters that are added into this movie honestly feel like lottery winners in my mind because ultimately the new actors that are presented within this film are lucky they should be there because I just don't care about them. Um, honestly, I do not understand this story because it's just like retconning and changing things just for the sake of changing things, and it just makes a giant portion of things that you've ever seen kind of pointless. If this is kind of the follow up to all of that stuff, or it is just kind of like this movie doesn't feel like a sequel to me. This feels like a offshoot movie. Like it doesn't, when looking at the bigger scope of all the other Terminator movies and then looking at this one, this movie feels cheaper by comparison. Um this movie honestly feels like a ripoff to me, but it has the same characters in previous iterations. This movie just kind of feels like a um it doesn't feel like a sequel to me. When again, kind of looking at the bigger scale of any of the other movies, the first one, second one, third one, fourth one, fifth one, blah 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 blah. It kind of just feels like either a ripoff or it just kind of feels like a just putting another one of those out there for the sake of putting another one of those out there. It doesn't feel like a grand scale of any kind in my mind. Um, but again, the only thing I liked about this movie was the action. If anything, you have some kind of additional things going on with the villain in this movie, the Terminator villain in this movie, which I did enjoy. I did like the kind of computer aspects of this, of how they go about doing the Terminator in this movie. But then ultimately, I just found a lot of weird things about it. I ultimately just kind of found it to just be kind of like, okay, sure. It feels like there's a lot of dead air in this movie. There's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of just kind of like, man, this movie is so slow. Even looking at any of the other films, this is probably the slowest Terminator movie I've ever seen in my life. And if you probably look at the very first Terminator film, you're like, well, the very first Terminator film was very slow. It was kind of like get to the point already. But if anything, the very first Terminator film was made to honestly just kind of really just be a horror film. It didn't really feel like an action film. This was much more of an action film, where the very first Terminator film felt much more like a horror film. There is quite a bit of times in this movie where there are throwbacks to previous lines of the film, because of course that's all they can seem to do in these things. Um, but here and there, there's a lot of Easter eggs to previous Terminator movies, which I did enjoy. I did like. Um, Honestly, for them to basically tell you that John Connor is in this film, really doesn't really mean a whole lick of anything to me. So if people were excited for John Connor to be any kind of portion placement within this film, basically his presentation within this film is honestly irrelevant. As much as a lot of the future stuff that they talk about this film does not really feel relevant. I feel like there was some portions of this where I'm just like, okay, like I honestly like Terminator Salvation better than this film. I honestly liked so many of the other things that came before this in my eyes. It's just like I know people might be like, no, this is a much better film than all those. I just don't think of that because ultimately it's just it feels like a giant ripoff of those past things that they just wanted to incorporate in here because there's no real honest to god original thinking within this movie. Recently it just felt like they were like it's just kind of a movie to wait for you to see Arnold. That's that's really what this movie was. Like, man, I can't wait to see Arnold. When is Arnold gonna come on? Whew, yeah, Arnold, where you at, buddy? Man, Arnold. Hey, where's that Schwarzenegger guy? Is he in this film? It's a wait to get to Arnold because ultimately everything previously that happens before that doesn't feel relevant enough. Like again, most of the actors that are placed within this film feel like a lottery winning choice. There is kind of future portions of this film and flashbacks within this film, and I did enjoy parts of that, but I don't know. It just this movie really falls flat for most of the point. It's just like if you weren't going to try and present a better movie than anything that happens previous, then you're just putting a movie out there just to see if you can make money. That's really what's going on here. It's just a movie to make money. It's a movie knowing full well that James Cameron is going to take this Terminator thing and like this is his baby now. he got his baby back. And so now, whenever he wants to make a Terminator movie, he can do so, because no one else is going to want to touch this Terminator franchise, this Terminator series. So ultimately, if James Cameron or the co-writer of the original Terminator, if they don't do this project, it won't get done. Because no one else is going to want to, no studio is going to want to touch this movie. So ultimately, James Cameron could have honestly completely 100% concluded this entire series and said that it's done, and no one else would be able to make another Terminator movie ever, because it'd be like, no, the Terminator movie, yeah, it's done. I'm done with it. Ultimately, at the end of this, they do kind of leave it open ended to where it could be a sequel, but I just don't think that I would want to go out of my way to see what becomes after this, because ultimately it's just like this movie didn't feel as equal to any of the other films in my eyes. It didn't like, it's not bringing anything to the table. It kind of feels like how kind of Universal Soldier was. Where Universal Soldier, like, the first one is really iconic and really pop culture-y. Universal Return was just kind of at a bigger scale, kind of, they had Bill Goldberg and John Claude Van Damme and stuff like that. But then they did like this Universal Soldier other one where they just had like, um they brought some of the original cast back, but it was in a movie that was so like gritty and grimy and dark and so seemingly cheaply made that it just kind of really just fell off the map, and it just, nobody wanted to see anything that was coming after that, and they bizarrely made sequels that honestly made no rational sense. Um, but yeah, it's just so like I'm kind of looking at this movie as the Universal Soldier franchise, where it's just like, okay, well, so basically, whatever's gonna come after this is not gonna be anything that I justifiably in my mind need to see, or think that it's going to be better than this film that's presented here. The only thing good about this movie is Sarah Connor and Arnold, but ultimately their performances are just kind of really just, they're there, but why should I care? um the only thing that is cool, like I said, is realistically the Terminator, the newer Terminator that's presented in this film, the action scenes that follow, and that's all that I can go through and really say in a non-spoiler variation, because ultimately everything else is just kind of just there. It's just kind of there to just like, let's get another one of these out there. Let's do another one of these things. And ultimately, for them to say, like, oh man, Sarah Connor is so cool in this movie, or for Arnold to really butter up the girl that played Sarah Connor, and he was like, man, she's such a badass in this movie, and she's really good, and she, yeah, and just, yeah, like looking at Sarah Connor in this movie, she's just just there. She's just there to just like shoot guns, and there's nothing about her that is really like, she's just kind of just there. Arnold is honestly just there. When he mentions that he's extremely funny within this movie, I'm like, not really. Like, he barely has any lines. He barely does much, and he's just there to get the price of sale tickets to go up, as well as Sarah Connor is. Everything about this movie is just kind of like they should have done more, and man, did they do way less. So that's all I could really say about this in a non spoiler variation, because I kind of feel like I'm kind of just spinning my wheels saying the same things. So I think I have much more to talk about in the spoiler variation, because ultimately, if people had seen this, I'm going to break it down in a much more sensible fashion of just saying super vague things that are just kind of don't feel quite relevant. So, I think that it's that time again to spoil this movie because at the end of the day, there's really not much to say about it. Like there's very few intriguing portions of this film, and it's never at all anything about the story of the film. Nothing good about this film has anything to do with story. So, like, basically, you're watching an entire film and just saying, oh, yeah, it looks really good. But ultimately, there's a ton of times when you're looking at this and it's like, yeah, this feels just like a past film. This feels like they're ripping off this movie. It feels like they're copying and pasting off of this thing to make it look cool. But the future does not look cool. The future does not look like anything that, like, it doesn't really feel like there's a real war going on in the future. It doesn't really feel like, it kind of feels like the Terminators for the future have kind of slowed down or given up. Um, yeah, it just it doesn't have the scale of other Terminator films. It just doesn't. So now, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's that time again to spoil this movie. At the end of the day, I just want to say that, man, this franchise have kind of has its ups and downs. A lot of people look at a lot of these other movies and they hate certain ones and like others. A lot of times, usually it's probably whichever one has Arnold in it, and actually really has Arnold in it, not um Arnold the computer character, or Arnold the CGI Terminator. Reasonably, I think it's now time to spoil this movie. So we have it to where this movie really takes place in Mexico, Mexico. And I'm just like, why? You have all these people speaking Spanish. I know a little bit of Spanish, but ultimately, I'm just like, why am I watching an action movie with subtitles? Because that's about half of the movie. A good portion of the movie is subtitled. And I'm like, why? I'm like, a Terminator movie with subtitles. Good, good idea. Great idea. Super, just, oh, great. What a great idea this was. And reasonably, we have it to where this Terminator is dropping down within Mexico because story. And ultimately, we have this girl, Danny, that is working in the factory, and all of a sudden, the factory that she's working in is starting to be robotic. And you know where this is leading. Automatically, people are like starting to say, hey, well, the boss wants to talk to you. I'm like, so he's getting fired, right? Because they're gonna get laid off because robots are taking control of these jobs. I think they're gonna do that even more because of the coronavirus scare. I probably shouldn't mention that word because ultimately I might this video might get demonetized because of because that could happen. But anyways, let's just kind of take that risk. So we go through here and we ultimately have the Terminator going and trying to find said Danny, and he speaks to the father. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I know where this is going. Ultimately leading to where the father is arriving at the factory and mentioning that they forgot their lunch. Well, already I was assuming, I'm like, well, of course, this new Terminator is Pop Pop. And I was like, yeah, of course, that's the way this goes. So we have it to where the Terminator is going and trying to kill Danny and her brother. And then blonde haired Terminator shows up, which she's like half human, half machine, or whatever the heck she is. She's augmented. And ultimately she is fighting this Terminator. I'm like, oh, okay, this is actually cool. Because ultimately this Terminator is kind of like Carnage like, where he kind of like is throwing these like projectile like weapons, and like he has very like venomous like blood or skin or whatever that is. And I'm just like, okay, like I can get into this. Like I feel like they're doing the whole black goop thing, so that way they don't have to spend so much on special effects. They can kind of just add appliances, because black goop is maybe easier to put on somebody's body rather than silver goop. So which I ultimately kind of thought that that was kind of like a kind of a cheaper thing, but ultimately I can just be like, nah, whatever. It's kind of cool looking, I guess. So we have this big old fight out leading to where ultimately it turns into like this fight out in this factory, which I thought was cool, and then it ultimately turns into a car chase scene, which I'm like, okay, here we go again. Here's T2 all over again, and basically that's what really this was, ultimately leading to the scene in which you see in the trailer of the Terminator getting out of the windshield onto the top of the car. But I'm like, ultimately, I'm looking, I'm like, what? I'm like, so this Terminator can be two Terminators? I'm like, ooh, this is interesting. Because ultimately, I just thought it was just gonna be um, like one or another, but we get double the dose of liquid and metal Terminator. All right, and they can be two separate entities? Hmm, interesting. But ultimately, looking at it, like, that's as far as the hill to really just die on really goes on here. Because ultimately, you just kind of have it to do us where, like, Sarah Connor just knows everything about the future, because ultimately, somebody is sending her texts via a potato chipped bag phone. Um, and she knows exactly where these people are at the exact right time. Ultimately, trying to defend this um, Danny and her soon to be dead brother, and this new Terminator that doesn't know anything about anything, because ultimately she's just there to do her mission. Because ultimately, what is revealed is that anything that is kind of like, there's this whole kind of future past kind of like barrier where like everything that happened in the past is not really what it is, and everything in the future isn't really what it is. So whatever kind of Sarah Connor knows isn't exactly what is the future, and whatever this girl from the future knows and Sarah Connor does, it like really conflicts. Which I'm just like, God, that just seems like they wanted to so badly just retcon everything, or just go like yeah, I just want to make the future mysterious, cuz I want to make a mysterious future that people aren't sure what's going on, so that way when we just kind of do whatever we want in this movie, it's okay. But anyways, we go to where this girl is um is meeting Sarah Connor. They're talking it out, because ultimately, without a doubt, this um this Terminator Terminator with an asterisk, because she's more human because she's augmented. So we'll call her the augmented Terminator. Which ultimately, this augmented Terminator, good God, her performance throughout this entire movie is just just even more than any of the other Terminators that were presented within this movie, or anybody that's ever acted in any of these films ever. It's just, she's just a bowl of just she's just, for a person that is probably going to take up most of the screen time. In my mind, I'm just like, what is the point of her? Like, and just supposed to be like an augmented human. So really, she is not this robotic whatever. Like, man, Kyle Reese, the oldest, the oldest Kyle Reese, put in a better performance than freaking this girl, and yeah, it's just like she has no emotion within this movie, and I get it. She's half robot, but then again, she's human. But she has just ugh. Her performances are ugh. So she's basically a Captain Marvel in my mind. Like it doesn't seem like it just kind of seems like she does her entire performances as a deer in the headlights, as if she's like not thinking of anything at all and she's just doing things. It seems like she's getting like fed her lines or what she's supposed to do. Like she never like looked at the script or whatever. She's just like, "Oh, I guess I have to do this now. All right." Cuz somebody's feeding me the entire time of telling me what to do and what to say, so I'm kind of saying back what they say through written words. So, like, hey, this is hard. It really is. It's just, man. So we have it to where Sarah Connor is kind of breaking down to this new girl what her future fate is, but ultimately she doesn't exactly know because she's just assuming that this girl is the new Sarah Connor. And ultimately I'm rolling my eyes at this because ultimately I'm just like, "Oh great. So we have some lottery winner here that is just going to be the future franchise portion of this movie. Why should I care? This person is completely unknown, and it just feels like they could have gotten anybody for this effing role. But surefire enough, this person who is casted as said person, Danny, is even going to be more important than I thought she was going to be because I just thought it's like, okay, well, she's just going to be there as like a placeholder for for really a person that is going to be much more important in the future. But yeah, so we just have these people that are now just escaping through Mexico, trying to break the border, ultimately trying to find Arnold because that's the real queuing up portion of this movie is that we had to wait an hour seemingly for Arnold to show up in this film. And all the while, we have Rodriguez, the guy who played Ghost Rider, is consistently trying to hunt these people down with phones, with cameras, with drones, and stuff like that. And I'm bored. I'm bored. Ultimately, leaning to where we seemingly have the ladies making their way beyond the border and eventually on their way to Arnold, where ultimately we find Arnold is very much kind of I Am Legend's Will Smith. like basically in the flashback, we have it to where Arnold is killing John Connor in a flashback. And I was just like, so this young John Connor has basically donut holes of zero worth of screen time. There's a flashback that's taken place that really doesn't have really much of anything to do that's anything cool. And then it's just to carry the storyline of just, okay, well, there is a Arnold Schwarzenegger out there that killed John Connor, and so Sarah Connor is ticked because ultimately John was the fate of this whole thing. It just seems like more and more that we go along these movies, they're trying as much as possible to make John Connor completely irrelevant. And like every single movie, they try to go out of their way to try to make John Connor a much more irrelevant person. It's kind of funny looking at the very first Terminator movie how John Connor was the most important thing. Terminator 2, John Connor was the most important thing. And then all of a sudden, like in Rise of the Machines, like all of a sudden it's like, oh no, like the babies of which John Connor create are much more important. And then after that, it's just like, well, no, like Kyle Reese is the most important thing, and then after that, it's Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor are the most important, and then like this one, it's just like, okay, nobody is really important but this one Danny girl, because ultimately we find out that even though John Connor is dead in a flashback, and ultimately Sarah Connor has to re-meet up with the Terminator, the model that had killed her son. Ultimately, it's just another one of those where it's just like, well, F it. Like, this robot over time has grown a heart 2 sizes and realizes that, like, realistically, considering this was the last Terminator, to go back into the past to try to prevent or try to preserve their future. Ultimately, this Terminator doesn't really have a future to anything, because ultimately now the future has completely been retconned and reset to where this Terminator does not actually exist anymore. Seemingly, it's not like he's gonna get any orders. It's not like he's gonna get any thing from Skynet. Just be like, "Hey, buddy, yeah, good times, right? High five." No. Um. So Arnold is just kind of like in this home, and he has family and friends and whoever. Ultimately, kind of like a Will Smith "I Am Legend" thing, where it's just like, well, I guess I survived the apocalypse, but what did I really get out of all this boatload of nothing? So ultimately, he's just like, well, I guess I should just become a good guy because I have nothing better to do. Q, where Sarah Connor and the lucky lotto winners make it their way to Arnold, and they're just like, "Hey, Arnold, how's it going?" Like, yeah, you're not none of the Arnolds from any of the other films again. So we can't hasta la vista, baby, or anything like that. We just can't do anything that reminds us of anything of the previous movies, because you're new model Arnold. So basically, the ultimate goal is for them to go up against this Terminator, because that's all they can effing do in these films. It's just like, well, the Terminator is gonna find him eventually, and Arnold better get his rear in gear, because he has nothing better to do. So reasonably, Danny is eventually within a plane flight. Well, there's gonna be a fight later on, which kind of is so scrambled and all over the goddamn place that it's just like, man, there's so much going on within this whole plane fight and whatever. It's so all over there, all over everywhere. So Arnold and within the plane and all this and that. Evidently, the Grace, the augmented Terminator, is eventually going to break down and eventually tell Danny why she's actually important. So basically, we have a future where eventually somebody does have to step up and be the John Connor of the world, because ultimately somebody has to, kind of honestly making John Connor one seem very irrelevant to all this, but ultimately whoever steps into John Connor's shoes, it doesn't matter at all. There's eventually going to be somebody that is going to be the John Connor of the world, making that this girl that has to be protected through this entire film honestly completely 100% irrelevant. So we find out that she doesn't have the key to all this. She is the key, and ultimately she just feels completely 100% irrelevant to me. Nauseously, I'm just like, really? This is how we're going to write this out? Is just she's the new John Connor, because evidently John Connor is not working out. Like, and there has to be some kind of much more like female empowerment, which definitely is placed within this film, which I'm okay with. Um, but it's just like, dude, the guy that we've built up for such a long time, to the point where in the Genesis movie they basically were saying that it's like, okay, well, John Connor is not the fate of the world. John Connor is the fate of the Terminator. So now we have to make John Connor completely irrelevant, even more so within the later films because sequels. So it's just at this point we have fighting within a plane, and I'm just like, what is relevant about this? Reasonably, there is no real goal for these people to go anywhere to survive, to hide out or anything. It's just kind of like, just keep trying to run away from this Terminator. And I'm assuming once this Terminator gets killed, there's probably just going to be another one sent. But evidently, Grace shows within the future how Danny is important, because ultimately she kind of changes everybody's viewpoint and makes them go like, you shouldn't be fighting each other, you should be fighting the machines. And again, throughout this entire movie, we have the "I'll be back" quote consistently happening. It's "I won't be back" or "I will be back" or something about back something. We also have the good old line of um, "the future is not set, the fate is what we make," and blah 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 blah. I was waiting for "it doesn't feel pity, it doesn't feel remorse, and it absolutely will not stop." God, I was waiting for that line because I really enjoy that much more so than anything. Because that feels like a really fun line to throw in there. Um, but they didn't go with that one. It's like, oh, so they're not going to use every single one of the gags from any of the other films that kind of become very reminiscent to the older films. So we have it to where they are fighting in some kind of factory esque like thing, and I'm like, okay, so is this gonna be they're gonna turn on all the machines and make the Terminator confused because all the tech stuff is going on? Like, this feels very reminiscent of the very end of the very first Terminator, where they have to just kind of battle it out in this weird, bizarre factory thing. And fighting, gunshots, pew pew, blah blah blah. It's just like another one of those fight sequences where I'm like, okay, this is clearly the end of the film, and I'm just like, good, because there's not much of a story in here that I could really care about or invest in, but I'm ultimately assuming who's gonna win out of all this, and ultimately who's gonna, like, it's not all of a sudden that Sarah Connor is gonna win and Grace is gonna win and Arnold's gonna win and they're just gonna all hug and then just end credits. No. Like, every portion of this movie, they have Arnold in this movie, they have new Terminator in this movie. How are they going to end up being completely 100% irrelevant? And it gets to the point where, like, Arnold from Genesis isn't still the same. It's not the same Arnold. It's not the same Arnold. God, it's not the same Arnold from Genesis. It's just retconning from a different Arnold, and just, oh, it's just. So we have an Arnold that saves Sarah Connor from when she was much younger, but that story is completely irrelevant. We have, oh God, we have just whatever. It's just, this is the third Terminator movie, and we just have to be happy with it. So instead of any of the other Salvation or whatever, all that stuff just completely is thrown out of the gate because John Connor becomes irrelevant. So we just have to just shrug our shoulders about that. So anyways, yeah, cuz all of this is just timeline wise of just like, okay, well, the future you is much better than the past you, so suck it up. So, and we have another like gun range thing where a girl that doesn't know how to shoot guns has to shoot guns, and that is what that is. Anyway, so again, like, we have it to where shooty shooty bang bang, and Arnold again has to kind of do the sacrifice play to save the day, because they had this whole pointless storyline of an EMP that ultimately quickly becomes irrelevant. So I'm like, man, there's a lot of stuff within this movie that just quickly just gets kind of just like shuffled off or thrown off to the side. Like, I was kind of thinking in my head that that military guy, Dean or whatever, was actually like Miles Dyson's son. I'm kind of wondering if that is actually Miles Dyson's son, because that would be kind of cool little Easter egg um, within this movie. Just like, oh my god, that's Miles Dyson's son, and like that would be how like she's so interconnected with that person to get this EMP. Anyways, so yeah, so Arnold makes a sacrifice play, and Terminators are dead, and we're just thinking, okay, now we can kind of like, we're good, right? We're fine, we're whatever, because ultimately Grace makes a sacrifice play to give her energy, heart, basically um, to destroy the Terminator, which has happened several FN times at this point now, where there's got to be some Terminator that has to give some energy source to rip out of their body to put into enemy Terminator to kill said thing. Again, these movies are so effing creative, it's crazy. So we get it to where, okay, like they didn't have an EMP device, but ultimately the Terminators within them have their own EMP device, which again I'm just sure whatever. So ultimately it just goes down to Arnold has to be the hero of this whole thing and take the sacrifice, and then ultimately we have to where Danny and Sarah Connor are just kind of like shrugging off their whole victory win and whatever, because ultimately Danny actually puts the boots to this Terminator for the first time in the entire film, because now she's actually irrelevant, because she actually has to sell this movie to people that she can actually be a future John Connor, which I don't buy. I don't. So we have it to her now that Danny is at this playground seeing Grace as a younger child, ultimately leading to the point of like, yeah, I don't want Grace to ever die for me again, but that's kind of moot point, because everything that happened in the past will have to happen regardless. There's nothing you're going to do to change anything. You can say the future is not set, but there's some stuff that you just cannot change. Um, Kyle Reese dying in the past, they changed that. But ultimately, a lot of the other things, everything is made to be put in motion, and there's nothing you can do about it to change what has already been put in motion. So, yeah, it's just Sarah Connor and Danny are just driving around because end of movie. And I'm just like, how is it that they're getting so much information if it just seems like they were left to just Danny and Sarah? Um, I don't know. There's just so much about this movie that I just kind of want to say like, man, I was hoping to get something out of this, but ultimately I felt that I got much less than any other film that's ever been done. I feel like I've just kind of like I feel like we've gone very much backwards to any of the other Terminator films that have been presented. Um, I just feel that having some of the stuff was just to do a lot of the film cheaper, and that was the goal, to just kind of do a very cheap movie that you can throw out there and slap a name like Terminator on something and people will go and see it, whether it has James Cameron on it, whether it has Arnold on it, whether it has all the other people that have been in the past movie. It's just this movie was just kind of a big step backwards, and it felt kind of just like, wow, there's no point in seeing this film. Because I felt like I've either seen it or there was nothing writing wise to justify going out of your way to watch it. So that's what I can mostly break this down to, is just, and half of it wasn't even in English. Seemingly half of it wasn't even in English. So, yeah, that's all I can really say about Terminator Dark Fate. If this is really the fate of which this franchise is going after this, I don't think there's going to be another one of these. Because what can they really give you at this point besides going into the future and doing an entire movie from the future again? Because I can't look at this and go that they're going to go back into the past again and doing a Terminator past film, because they've kind of technically already done that with Genesis. I can't see them going and doing like if they do a future film that's gonna just be Terminator Salvation all over again. So basically, it's just I will not care about the storyline that continues with Danny. I just don't, because ultimately it's just like, well, Sarah Connor is the only one that's tied to any portion of this franchise, and so if she's alive in the sequel, then I guess they'll be worth watching. But I'm assuming Arnold isn't coming back because ultimately it kind of cemented that Arnold is the very last um, Terminator, which is tied to Skynet, which is tied to Cyberdyne, which is tied to whatever. Everything after that is just going to be these Legion guys that look like Rodriguez from the guy who played Ghost Rider. They're all going to be black goop and whatever, and they're all going to be black Terminators. So, yeah. So that's all I have to say about Terminator Dark Fate. Um, yeah. I feel pity. I feel remorse. And I absolutely will not stop until I hope that there is a better Terminator coming within our future. But I don't think that is ever going to be a thing anymore. Because there's no way to really write these to justify where these movies are going to go in the future. There's nothing to be excited about. Like, kind of this one kind of killed the excitement about these films. So, you know what? I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.